We start off this story by seeing a man on his knees breathing heavily, clearly exhausted. Then a man in white took a step closer to the person on the ground, saying one couldn't pay to see an extraordinary sight. It then pans out and we see what could be hundreds of knights tired of fighting this lone person. We then see someone who could be the general say that the guy on his knees is indeed that person's brother. We get the name of the protagonist, which is Lord Cyan Vert. Cyan Vert says the general's name, which is Boris. We then see Boris smiling creepily. Cyan Vert grabs his red sword and uses some sort of power and questions Boris on who ordered him to do this. While exuding more power, he questions if it was the emperor who ordered him to do it. Boris hesitates and covers his face while saying that vile black mist. He continues saying that the rumors are true. Cyan Vert stands up and exudes a massive amount of his power. Boris then says that Cyan Vert is an assassin belonging to the mist. He continues saying that the mist is a fog that casts a pall over his order of light. He then says he will report that he has crushed Cyan Vert the rebel. Cyan Vert goes in a fighting pose and threatens him by saying he can if he still has a mouth to do it. Boris, blocking the wind, states that if Cyan Vert is planning to escape with a secret technique, that he can forget about it, because he casted a 9-star magical barrier there. Cyan Vert thinks to himself that he needs to escape and go to his brother to figure out who's behind this. He then speaks up saying with or without the barrier he will raise it all. He then hears someone say enough Cyan. And as he approaches, Boris bows to him. Cyan looks confused and froze up, and thinks to himself that the person behind this was his own brother Yahello. As Yahello approaches, Cyan drops to his knees. Yahello speaks and says to Cyan that Cyan's eyes tell him that he doesn't know why he's here. Yahello stops walking as soon as he gets to Cyan and casts a shadow over him with his body. Cyan asks Yahello, what does this mean? Yahello coldly tells him that he has performed his duties well, for their family name and the people, and for himself. As soon as those words left Yahello's mouth, Cyan looked shocked. Yahello continues saying that Cyan has carried this weight for decades and that he will lift that weight off his shoulders. Cyan, still in denial and confused, questions him if he had done anything wrong. Yahello glares at Cyan and repeats Cyan's words, done something wrong? He continues saying that he sees the evil fog around him. He is no longer human and that Cyan is nothing more than a vile murderer. Yahello then accuses Cyan that he has been deceiving them this whole time. He points at him and questions Cyan's if he really does not know of any of the heinous sins he is guilty of. Cyan thinks to himself, a murderer? Heinous sins. He then stares daggers at Yahello and thinks to himself, how dare he? The feud for the imperial crown, the suppression of the demon army, the war for the unification of the continent. He thinks to himself that he helped Yahello succeed in everything he started, because dedicating Cyan's life to Yahello was also for his own good. And now Yahello wants to just toss Cyan aside. He then exudes even more power, thinking to himself after he has worked like a dog for Yahello for 20 years, he just will not accept that. He starts bleeding heavily, but he dismisses it, thinking that he doesn't care if he destroyed his own body and that he is going to put everything he has into this very moment. He doesn't care as long as he can destroy Yahello. The soldiers are shocked and they say it should be impossible for him to have this much magic left, and continues by saying it is beyond human. Cyan speaks and says that it's laughable. Yahello is supposed to be the great hero of the continent, and yet he feels so scared of his younger brother that he needs to kill him. Cyan then asks if he has no shame. Yahello is visibly upset but stays quiet. Cyan then immediately started rushing Yahello. They then start fighting each other. Cyan thinks to himself that all he needs is one hit. He's going to swing and thinks that if he hits a vital point that won't be able to heal, he would win. Cyan then hits Yahello in the back with a powerful swing but is blocked by a shield. Cyan is confused but then sees Boris, who casted the shield. Yahello then says poor fool as he stabs Cyan in the stomach. He speaks to Cyan saying that he had wished to give a peaceful send-off to him, but that Cyan just had to reveal his true colors. He then says he recognized Cyan's true nature a long time ago and says that he's glad he never once fully trusted him. That sentence left the now normal Cyan shook. Yahello then kicks Cyan off his sword and turns his back and tells Boris for them to go. Cyan lies there on death's door and thinks to himself that's how it all ends, and that what a foolish life he's led, how pathetic. Yahello hears a noise and turns around and sees Cyan getting ready to attack him. Cyan yells die to Yahello, and right before he can slit Yahello's throat, he gets blasted away with a powerful beam. We then see Cyan gasping while holding his neck. We then see a maid asking him when he's going to get up and that it's time for him to get ready. Cyan then yells the maid's name, which is Emily, which startled the maid. The boy continues by asking her what she's doing here. The boy is confused and thinks to himself that it's been nearly 20 years since he's seen her and she hasn't changed at all. He then remembers that this was his room when he was a child. He then feels his face and wonders if he turned back into a young boy. Emily gets Cyan's attention and questions if it's because he doesn't want to go to the sparring match. She then tells him to gather his courage and go. Cyan is confused and asks what sparring match. The house he is in is called the Castle of the House of Duke Verd. He still questions if all this is just his life flashing before his eyes. He remembers this day 27 years ago. It was 1 year before he entered the academy. There was a sparring match held at the beginning of each month in their territory. It was a very important event that Cyan's father, the Duke, observed in person. Cyan's opponent was Cransford. He was Cyan's half-brother and the same age as him. Crans's mother was Margaret Argaeus, the Duchess, which is why despite both of them being the youngest out of the 4 sons, Crans received more attention. Cyan was an illegitimate child of indeterminate origins, and Cyan's humiliation that day made him a laughing stock to everyone around him. That was the day Cyan's father lost all interest in him. Emily asks Cyan if he can just forfeit. Cyan just responds with "Nah, I'd win." He thinks to himself that even the maid thinks he's hopeless. As he pulls out the rapier, he is surprised by the weight of the rapier. He thinks to himself that this doesn't feel like a dream or his life flashing before his eyes. And he's never heard of any kind of magic that can cast this kind of illusion. He still questions if he really went in the past. Crans taunts him by saying that Cyan is courageous, and that he thought that Cyan wouldn't show up. Cyan hesitantly looks at his father, but all his father said was for them to begin. Crans immediately leapt toward Cyan and told him, "Where do you think you're looking at, halfwit?" Crans raises his sword and is about to strike Cyan. Cyan looks at him and thinks to himself that Crans is as slow as a snail. Cyan just sidesteps Crans' swing, which made him hit the floor. Crans looks back at Cyan annoyingly, and before he has a chance to swing again, Cyan easily disarms him and kicks him in the shin hard. Crans immediately fell on the floor, clutching his shin in pain. Margaret yelled Crans's name while the king is surprised. Cyan looms over his opponent and thinks to himself that to win all he needs to do is point his sword in Crans's neck. He clenches his sword and thinks that he isn't satisfied. In a flashback, we see that Crans used to make Cyan's life miserable for his own entertainment. The harassment even continued at the academy. Back to the present, we see that Cyan wants to beat him so badly that he won't think of doing that again. Cyan swings his foot backwards and thinks to himself that this time he will live for himself as he kicks Crans in the face. Crans suffered a crushing defeat in the sparring match. After the match, Cyan's father even postponed his plans in order to meet with Cyan. Cyan thinks to himself that he must have impressed his father if he sent a high knight to escort him to his office. We then see Margaret and her maid walk in their directions. Cyan thinks that she must be coming from the infirmary because of her son. He even smiles a bit when he notices she is mad. Cyan asks her if Crans is okay. She tries to berate him for what he did to Crans, but Cyan dismisses her and says it was a sparring match and what she expected. She then said this is why they say not to mix people below your class. That seemed to really strike a nerve in Cyan. She continues saying that Cyan came from a vulgar womb and no wonder why he's so cruel. She goes on saying he should be grateful that he's not groveling in the streets where he belongs. Cyan is really pissed off and thinks she just crossed that line. As he turns to look at her, he questions himself if he should kill her. He dismisses the idea and thinks of a better way to make her mad. He calmly speaks to Margaret and says if she knows that he is entering the academy with Crans, she is confused and asks what he's getting at. He then questions if she is worried and threatens that Crans might not graduate the academy with all his limbs intact. She is mad and speechless at the threat. She then tries to slap Cyan for the comment. The guard protects Cyan and apologizes. He tells her that the Duke is expecting them, and for her to excuse them while menacingly looking at her. She is hesitant but backs up. Cyan snickers and thinks to himself that the Duke's orders are absolute. He continues that he is even being protected by a knight that received the order. He thinks that it's reassuring to have a knight that doesn't bend to the Duchess. The knight knocks at the door and the Duke tells him to come in. As he stands facing the window, Cyan introduces himself by saying he's Cyan, the youngest of the House of Vert, standing in your presence, your grace. Cyan thinks to himself that this is the first time in 15 years where they spoke in private. He tells Cyan to sit, The Duke's name is Duke Weliersvert, the lord who rules over the western territory of the Wusif Empire. He is called by many the guardian of the continent, the great hero who is gifted with powerful magic and a sharp mind, and the one who stopped the invasion of the demons. Until his death during the invasion of the Demon King, his only wish was for peace on the continent. Cyan's memory of him is slightly different. He was a man who has chosen to live his entire life in service of others, and Cyan thinks he was a fool. Once the Duke was seated, he told Cyan that he dodged the sword knowing exactly where it was going. Cyan is confused and wants him to elaborate. The Duke goes on saying when Kranz lunged at Cyan, he saw the trajectory of his sword and turned his body just enough to dodge it. The Duke asked Cyan when he learned his swordsmanship. Cyan was a bit surprised he caught on to that, so he lied and said he didn't and just trained himself every night. The Duke responds that the Cyan he knows has no talent for the sword, let alone any interest. He questions how he hides such talent. Cyan, blushing while scratching his head, responds saying that he just didn't want any attention on him. The Duke sarcastically remarks that for someone who didn't want to draw any attention, Cyan really outmaneuvered Kranz masterfully. The Duke then questions Cyan why he kicked him at the end. Cyan thinks to himself that this question might be an attempt to judge his character. He replied that he wanted to prove himself. The Duke is confused and asks what he means. Cyan goes on saying although they are half-brothers, he wanted to prove he is superior to Kranz, and he came to the conclusion that that was the purpose of these sparring matches. The Duke let out a chuckle which surprised Cyan a bit. The Duke commends Cyan for the sharp and straightforward answer. He tells Cyan that he is overjoyed that he has such a talent. He smiles and says that Cyan will be a great assistance to Yahello someday. Cyan is alarmed and thinks to himself that nothing has changed, and the Duke is still obsessed with Yahello. The Duke, oblivious to his true feelings, goes on saying that he would like to give Cyan something for winning the match and asks him what he wants. Cyan then has a conviction to destroy everything that Yahello sets out to do. Before we hear what Cyan chose for a gift for winning the match, we cut to Emily screaming that Cyan wants to go to the front lines. Cyan confirms to her that that was his prize but says that nothing has been decided yet. Emily worries for Cyan, saying that there are a lot of beasts in the front lines. Cyan's territory is Velia's, the westernmost region of the Wusif Empire. It's the only place in the empire that is referred to as the front lines. And the foremost area of the front lines is Limia Valley, where the centuries-long war against the demons continues to rage on. Cyan's father was adamant against Cyan going there but eventually agreed on one condition: that Cyan must be qualified to go to Lima Valley within a month. But Cyan doesn't know what the qualifications are yet. He thinks to himself that the first thing he will do is build as much muscle as possible. He thinks that he is still weaker compared to his peers. He thinks that his one advantage is his battle instincts from his previous life, and he still feels a bit of magic in his body. Someone then barges into his room yelling his name. Then we see it's someone named Ellis. She immediately grabs Cyan by the collar of his shirt and yells at Cyan if he lost his marbles. Emily says hi to her but gets ignored. While still holding his shirt, she yells at him if he asked their father to go to the front lines. Cyan then asks his sister if she could let him go first. She lets go of him and says in a calmer tone that he must think he's a real warrior for beating Kranz in a sparring match, and she won't have it. She then tells him to go to the rooftop. Ellis lays out the rules and says the sparring begins as soon as the swords are drawn, and if he can withstand her attacks for 3 minutes, she let him get to the front lines. He then asks her if this is really necessary. She ignores that and asks him one question: is he really interested in carrying on the family name? He thinks to himself if that is what it's about, because he has zero interest in doing that. She assumes he does and starts pulling out her sword. He thinks to himself that he just sparred today, that it's getting exhausting. She then lunges at him, but he parries her strike, which makes Ellis surprised. She thinks to herself how a 10-year-old blocked that strike. Cyan, who looks like he is struggling, thinks to himself if Ellis really won't hold back against a brother that's 7 years younger than her. Ellis then jumps back after the first strike. She is still shocked the fact Cyan parried her longsword. She hides her anger and thinks that it may have been a fluke and tells Cyan that he is better than she expected. Cyan, scared now, thinks he's screwed, now calls Ellis's name. She comes at him again, launching more strikes at his direction, which he is blocking. Ellis then gets ready to do a strong swing. Cyan blocked the swing with great difficulty. He then gets his sword past hers and is about to strike at her. He then twists the sword, then both him and Ellis jumps back. Cyan thinks to himself that that was close, and that if he hadn't twisted his sword he could have killed her. He explains that most Black Mist swords techniques kills the victim instantly. He then thinks considering how weak he is if the fight goes on it will be impossible to keep fighting without killing her. He sweats and wonders how much longer until the 3 minutes are up. He thinks that he's making up for his lack of strength by channeling his magic into his sword, but he's almost at his limit. Ellis, who is also panting, starts chanting a spell. Cyan is caught off guard that she is using level 6 magic. After she's done chanting her spell it looks like she is going to kill Cyan. Cyan thinks the same thing and starts sweating buckets. He thinks to himself that even if he blocks her attack he will go flying over the castle walls. Cyan then jumps toward Ellis as she is preparing to attack him. He then starts thinking when something is going to come out. Then suddenly Jurkin the Knight comes out and yells for them to stop. He catches Cyan and blocks Ellis's attack at the same time. Him blocking Ellie's swing then caused an explosion of energy. He then calmly calls Ellis and questions if she's going a bit overboard since her opponent is still 10 years old. Cyan is relieved because he thought the knight wasn't going to come for a second. Ellis realized what she had done and hugs Cyan as she apologizes for going overboard. She cries on Cyan's shoulder and revealed that she couldn't stand to see him in the front lines and was so intent on stopping him that she forgot what she was doing. Cyan tells us that Ellis went to the academy where all the most talented students in the continent went and she was unmatched in all subjects. Because of her beauty to match, people called her godchild. Her and Yahello were both considered the next potential guardians of the continent. But her life came to an end not long after she joined the Order of Light. Cyan tightens his hug on Ellis and swears to himself that he will protect her. Ellis turns around and questions the guard whose name is Jurkin why he's here if her father left for a journey. Jurkin responded that her father told him to protect Cyan for the time being and he told Jurkin to do it in secret. Cyan thinks to himself that he noticed as soon as he left his father's office and questions if Jurkin would have come out if he did a better job pretending not to notice. And he thinks why did his father tell Jurkin to protect him in secret? Ellis notices that Cyan fell asleep in her arms. She lets out a chuckle and says he's still a child after all. Cyan does push-ups while telling us that Ellis went to the academy. He thinks that he badly needed to focus on building muscle and he did for 2 weeks, but it's been nothing but disappointment since he can only do a max of 10 push-ups after that time. He thinks back to his old physique and wants another plan to try and match it. Emily comes in saying that Ellis sent him a package, but she comments on the smell. Cyan thinks that he used Ellis's sympathy about the duel to make her send him some Hellhound's blood. He continues thinking that Hellhound blood is a rare item which people only obtain from the Limia Valley. But it turns out that it being available at the black market are true. As he pours it into a bowl he thinks that since the blood of a demon beast smells terrible and causes a burning sensation in the mouth people think that it's a poison. But if consumed it can permanently increase physical and magical power. As he picks up the bowl, Emily is questioning if he is actually going to drink it, and he confirms. As he drinks it he thinks that he is the only person to learn to stomach her cooking and compared to that this was nothing. He slams the empty bowl on the table and yells it is delicious. He stands up and calls for Emily and tells her that he is going on a walk. He thinks that he wants to test how well it worked. As he walks he notices another spot that he hasn't been at for a long time and says he has been waiting for this day. The day that Jurkin is going to give him his routine report. And thinks that he used to come to this spot when he wanted to be alone. One day Yahello received a divine revelation from the Lemendal, the god of light, saying an ancient shrine was hidden somewhere in the backwood of Velias. He touches the ground and thinks that they weren't sure what to believe but found a spot with a concentration of mana flow, but in this life the revelation hasn't happened yet. He smiles and thinks that he's the only one that knows about it. He then makes the ground crack in front of him. He then thinks that Yahello has no idea what he's going to do, as we see the rock that cracked away opened a path to a secret underground staircase. Thank you for watching until the very end. Please like and subscribe and hit the bell. If you want a part 2 to this video, comment part 2.